So we're going to dive a little bit deeper now into some of these specific issues that were raised, looking at the health impacts of climate change. We're going to be covering the topics of infectious diseases, mental health, and community health impacts. And we have a really great panel of people. You can look at their bios on this sheet here. And our first speaker is Dr. George Reese, and he's going to be talking about infectious disease implications. And his bio can be found here, but he has, well, I'll let you read his bio. He's a brilliant physician.
Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you already, but thank you very much. What a great conference we're having, and I'm really very honored and privileged to participate and to talk to you about some of the infectious disease implications of the global climate change. It's a vast topic, and 30 minutes will give me a chance just to really touch on several of the most important issues. So what I want to try and cover with you this morning is the effect of climate change on biodiversity in the biggest sense of that word. The changes in vector behavior. You've heard a little bit about mosquitoes, but we're talking about all different kinds of vectors. Mosquitoes, ticks, rodents, migratory waterfowl, and even bats, and how their behavior as the reservoirs for various kinds of infectious diseases is being changed as a result of climate change. Changes in the distribution or the behavior of the pathogens themselves. We'll talk a little bit about bacterial diseases, fungus diseases, et cetera, in those regards. And something that isn't often thought about, but some of the new diseases that are starting to be recognized, partially at least, as a result of global climate change. Now, when Dr. Milan first asked me to give a talk about the effects of global warming on climate change, it was easy. Sure, you know, rising temperatures, more mosquitoes, more malaria, end of story. So, but when you start reading about these topics, it's immensely much more complex, and it's very difficult to read about climate change without seeing some of these other aspects that tie in. And in the real world, this is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with not only climate change, but also changes in land use, deforestation, desertification, a decreased availability of fresh water, a decline in biodiversity, changes in global transport, trade, air pollution. We've heard quite a bit about all of these already from the first speaker. And perhaps most important is the mass migrations, is the social unrest, including war, famine, poverty, urbanization. All of these things interact one with the other, and all of them have a major impact on infectious diseases. And so when I talk about some of these topics, climate change is one of many things that's affecting the outcomes of many of these diseases. There's competing influences in climate change. On the one hand, you have milder winters and hotter and humid summers. On the other hand, you have drought and heavy rainfall and increased energy demand. And so, for instance, if a mosquito is living in a hotter temperature, they actually metabolize more rapidly, and so their lifespan is actually shorter in a higher temperature. And one person in the question and answer this morning was already asking about some of the effects, and it's very clear that the effects already are here. So global climate change and an effect on infectious diseases, it's not a theoretical, it's already happening. Even as long ago as 10 years ago, the WHO estimated that climate change was already causing about 150,000 deaths per year and 5.5 million lost daily adjusted life years. So, and that was 10 years ago, and those changes are just accelerating as a result of increase in these changes. So biodiversity, and I'm defining it as the number and the variety of living organisms and their genes, of course, of all types and sizes that are living in an ecosystem. So we're talking about plants, animals, bacteria, viruses, and the microbiome. And the microbiome is an enormously important topic that we're only starting to understand now as a result of development in the past 10 years or so of new ways of identifying organisms that we previously couldn't identify because we couldn't culture them. And as we're developing non-culture methods for identifying organisms that are present in the soil, in oceans, in swamps, and especially in the human body, we're starting to recognize that the biodiversity is enormous, and that biodiversity is also declining as the result of a lot of different changes that are going on in the environment. And importantly, the interactions of all of these different organisms within the environment are not completely understood yet, and yet we're seeing changes that are happening that are quite profound. You can see that the major drivers of biodiversity are here, and climate change is the second most important one in this article from Nature from 2007. I would add, especially in terms of the microbiome, a major driver is the profligate use of antibiotics. I'm not talking about antibiotics that are used for human health, although that is a small one. But remember that 80+% of all the antibiotics that are made in this country are sprayed on crops and are given to livestock. And they get into our food chain. They affect the biodiversity of the bacteria in the soil, in the oceans, in the waters, etc. And that's another major driver of decreased biodiversity. So what happens as the result of declining biodiversity? Well, there's a smaller genetic pool for adaptation of the changing environment. There's big changes in the food chain. There's declines in plants, fungi, bacteria from which medicinals are discovered, and that may decline as well. Remember that about 90% of all the antibiotics that we have are derived from nature, are derived primarily from fungi in the soil. And as we decrease the number of microorganisms, we may find fewer new sources for anti-cancer drugs, for antibacterials, for antifungal agents, etc. There's a decline in insect-eating species, especially bats, and as a result there might be more insects because they're not being consumed anymore. Increased ocean acidity is happening as well. And finally, and most interestingly to me as a clinician, is that there's a clear interaction between biodiversity and the education of the immune system. The immune system, we're recognizing now, has to be stressed in order to be educated. And a term, the hygiene hypothesis, is not a very good term. What we prefer now is the old friends hypothesis, where an awful lot of organisms in the environment, as well as in our own microbiome, have an effect on immune regulation. And as we take these away, we end up having more drivers of inflammation, etc. And so we're seeing in the world more autoimmune diseases like lupus, like diabetes. There's more asthma. There's more multiple sclerosis as we are getting rid of some of these organisms. And some of the organisms that are very important, the so-called pseudocommensals, organisms in mud and water, fermented food and drinks. And these are the kinds of organisms I'm talking about that are being cut away as the result of changes in the climate, as well as in the use of antibiotics, etc. So let's just talk about a few specific diseases. I wanted to talk, just to give you a sort of a broad cross-section, I wanted to talk about at least one protozoan, at least one virus, at least one bacteria, and at least one fungus, just so you sort of get the broad spectrum of what we're talking about. So mosquitoes are definitely affected by climate change, and these are the carriers for dengue, for malaria, for West Nile virus, lymphatic filariasis, several other diseases as well. Sandflies that carry leishmania, the triatomes that carry Chagas disease, ticks, which are major vectors for Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever virus, which is something that we don't hear much about in this country, but it's expanding its geographic range both in Africa as well as in Central Europe. It's a big problem in Turkey right now, and expansion of the range of ticks is one of the major reasons. Tick-borne encephalitis encephalitis virus, which is also all the way across Europe, and spirochetes like Borrelia, like relapsing fever, like Lyme disease, etc. As we change tick behavior, then we're seeing increases in all of these. Black flies that carry the sleeping sickness, onchocerciasis, which is river blindness, the second most common cause of blindness in the world, is transmitted by black flies. Snails that are the immediate host for schistosomiasis, the so-called Pharaoh's plague pandemic. There's probably 200 million people in the world who carry schistosomiasis, and as we see more flooding and more damming, etc., we see more snails as the vectors, and there's more schistosomiasis as the result. Malaria. Excuse me. Still a big problem. Somewhere around 250 to 500 million illnesses every year, with 1 million deaths. 40% of the globe is at risk for disease. There's 5 different species. We've recently recognized Plasmodium knowlesi. We used to think that these were organisms that were only present in humans, but we now recognize that knowlesi is one that is present in monkeys as well. And what's interesting is that there's several competent mosquito vectors. We talk about the Anopheles mosquito, but there's several different species of Anopheles. And the Anopheles gambiae is the one that you see in Africa, and it's the most efficient vector. But there's several other mosquito vectors that are completely capable of carrying this parasite. And if you look at the endemic areas of the world, you can see that in America, for instance, and in Europe, we don't have malaria, but we did. And we got rid of them primarily through spraying of larvicides, DDT, et cetera, to kill off the mosquitoes. But they've come back, and we have very competent vectors. So Anopheles freebornii in the west, Anopheles quadrimaculatus in the east, and in Europe there's 14 different species of Anopheles that are capable of carrying malaria. And so malaria is not gone from these countries because the mosquitoes are not there. And as global warming happens, these mosquitoes may come back, and we also are seeing more population shifts and people carrying this disease coming into these countries. And we've seen outbreaks of malaria in New Jersey, for instance, in Puerto Rican populations who have come up carrying the disease, and the Anopheles mosquitoes there that are present there can transmit disease. We heard earlier about the minimum temperatures for parasite development, and it's about 18 degrees centigrade for falciparum and about 15 degrees centigrade for vivax. And we're seeing in the East African highlands that we heard about this morning a little bit, that warming trends there going back to 1950 or so have definitely corresponded with an increase in the incidence of malaria in those areas. The confounding variables, of course, are decreasing control efforts, so less mosquito control efforts, also clearing of land for agriculture, and increasing drug resistance. These are all drivers for emergence of malaria as well. Excessive monsoon rainfall definitely predicts malarial epidemics in the Punjab region of India, and epidemics increase 5-fold during the year following an El Nino event as the result of moisture causing mosquito breeding habitats to go up. And also the damming of rivers, deforestation, etc., also can create new habitats. But it's not always quite that clear, because if you look at the Sahel region of Africa, which is this region, this band below sub-Saharan Africa that has been in drought now for several years, we're seeing an overall decline in the incidence of malaria and other mosquito-borne diseases in these areas. And so the consensus is starting to coalesce around perhaps we will see a little bit of an increase in malaria, but what's going to happen is a big change in the distribution of malaria. So that we'll see malaria in areas where we haven't seen it before, but perhaps we're seeing a little bit less as the result of drought and the mosquitoes not able to live in some of these areas. Dengue, switching over to viruses now. Pandemic already. There's probably 50 million or so cases of dengue annually. And what's important about dengue is that there's 4 different serotypes. And those 4 different serotypes used to be distributed unevenly across the globe, but as the result of global traffic, etc., now pretty much all 4 species, all 4 serotypes of dengue are found throughout the globe. And that's important because if you you contract dengue and recover from it, you are immune to that strain. But if you were then exposed to a different strain of dengue, there's about a 2% chance that you'll develop dengue hemorrhagic fever, which is a very, very serious life-threatening illness. And so we're seeing more cases of dengue hemorrhagic as the result. Now, the major mosquito vector for this is Aedes aegypti, and it's a very urbanized, very social mosquito that likes to live in very small environments like water pots, like flower pots, etc. But there's a second major vector, Aedes albopictus, the so-called Asian tiger mosquito, and it's called that because of its aggressive biting habits. And the geographic range of that secondary vector has also been expanded. This pandemic is being fueled by failed control efforts. We tried to get rid of a lot of mosquitoes when we were trying to eliminate malaria back in the 1950s and 60s. Those efforts have failed and have been abandoned. Global climate change, global traffic of scrap tires of all things has been a major driver in the emergence of these mosquitoes in new areas of the world, as well as global traffic of people who are carrying the virus in incubating disease, get bitten by a mosquito in a new area, and then can start a new disease. This is a map of the distribution of Aedes aegypti in the Americas from Dwayne Gubler. And you can see that back in the 1930s, it was widely distributed throughout the United States, southern half, as well as Central and South America. And as the result of mosquito control efforts, it was in major decline by 1970, and it's come roaring back now even 10 years ago. And now we have as much Aedes aegypti in this hemisphere as we did back in the 1930s. It's present in the United States, but it can't survive in cold weather, and so we see Aedes aegypti primarily in the southeast. But Aedes albopictus was introduced in the United States in 1985 in scrap tires from North Asia that were brought into Houston, Texas. And if you ever tried to pour water out of a used tire, it's virtually impossible. And so these tires that are brought in carry water, and these mosquitoes love to breed in these very, very small environments. And so this Aedes mosquito was brought into Houston, is now spread again throughout the United States, and it, different from Aedes aegypti, is able to overwinter, and actually it's much more cold tolerant, and they found it as far north as Wisconsin. And so there's definitely the possibility of dengue outbreaks in this country as well. These are a couple examples of what dengue hemorrhagic fever looks like. It's a capillary leak type syndrome with a significant hemorrhage, and it is treatable if you get to medical attention quickly enough, but it's a potentially life-threatening disease. We heard a little bit about heavy precipitation events and what happens as the result of when it rains so hard that you overwhelm your sewer system, and that sewer system then backs up into the storm drains, etc. And this has happened on several occasions. Two examples that Dr. Patz actually mentioned in this article from Medical Clinics. In Ontario in May 2000, heavy precipitation, failing infrastructure, there was a big outbreak of E. coli and Campylobacter causing 2,000 illnesses. 7 people died. There was an enormous outbreak in Milwaukee in 1993 of Cryptosporidium, which is another parasitic diarrheal agent that followed after heavy spring rains and runoff from melting snow. There were 400,000 people that were exposed. This was back before we had good therapy for the HIV disease, for instance, and so an awful lot of people with HIV disease weren't able to clear this disease and had months and months of diarrhea caused by Cryptosporidium. 50 people died, but it was just a major thing. Again, these changes in precipitation are very important. Another example, this is the daily hospitalizations for diarrhea fluctuating by daily temperature in Lima, Peru. And you can see that every time the temperature goes up, then the number of admissions for diarrhea, primarily by bacteria that are overgrowing, goes up as well. And so major effects on health as a result of increasing temperature. 67% of all waterborne disease outbreaks are preceded by heavy rainfall, we heard yesterday morning from Dr. Patz. For instance, salmonella, definitely related to warm temperatures, especially when the temperatures get warmer than 6 degrees above the average. Same thing with Campylobacter, which is another major cause of foodborne outbreaks of disease. Now let's switch to the marine environment for just a moment, and we'll talk about Vibrios. Vibrios are what are called halophilic bacteria, so that means that they like to live in seawater. And so Vibrio cholera is the major one that we know about. There's also Vibrio vulnificus, which is a big problem in the oyster industry, especially in Louisiana and Mississippi, etc. The optimal temperature for cholera is body temperature, 37 degrees. And so as ocean temperatures get warmer and warmer, you have more and more growth of these halophilic Vibrios, such that in Bangladesh, cholera outbreaks follow seasonal warming of sea surface temperature. And there's definitely interannual variability of cholera, strongly related to sea surface temperatures in the Bay of Bengal there, and also the El Nino Southern Oscillation and flooding and monsoons. All of these are associated with outbreaks of cholera, which again is a life-threatening disease. Fungi are not immune to the effects of climate change. This is valley fever, Coccidioides immitis, which is a big problem in the desert southwest part of this country, so Arizona, New Mexico, Southern California. It's a soil-dwelling fungus that you acquire as a result of inhalation, and as the soil is disturbed, then inhalation of this spore can cause pneumonia and also can cause devastating illness, especially if you have immune compromise, as you would with HIV infection, with cancer, etc. Most people actually develop this infection and are asymptomatic or only have a very minimal illness. And so the cases that we recognize are actually only the tip of the iceberg. Perhaps as little as 5% of cases of cocci are actually recognized clinically based on serologic studies of people who live in an endemic area. The first true epidemic occurred after a massive dust storm in 1978. Then there was an outbreak in 1994 following an earthquake. In the years 91 to 94, there was a 14-fold increase in the incidence when a 5-year drought was ended by above average rainfall. And so again, high precipitation is a big factor here. There's been a steady increase in cases in Arizona and California over the last 10, 15 years. And in 2012, Arizona saw 9,000 documented cases. And if that's only the tip of the iceberg, there are probably 100,000 or more cases of cocci in Arizona alone. And the spikes are always preceded by heavy fall and winter precipitation, allowing the organism to proliferate, and then with increased construction or other kinds of disturbances in the soil also causes the organism to be dispersed up into the atmosphere and breathed in to cause disease. Internationally, Rift Valley is a very, very interesting viral infection. It was first described in the 1930s around the Rift Valley here in Kenya. It's a mosquito-borne disease that is highly fatal to livestock. When livestock that have not lived in an environment like this for a long period of time, when this virus is introduced into this into a community like that of non-immune livestock, then there's massive die-offs of disease. Human disease happens as well with hemorrhagic fever as well as blindness as a complication. And it used to be confined to sub-Saharan Africa, but there's been a big expansion in Rift Valley as a result of man-made changes in the environment. And so one example is the Aswan Dam in Egypt, creating Lake Nasser. There has been traffic of cattle that carry this virus across Lake Nasser into Egypt, causing an outbreak. There's also deforestation. And what's very interesting and very important is that, again, competent mosquito vectors have been found in America, Europe, and the Philippines. And so there's the possibility for for this organism in the same way as West Nile was introduced into this country. Rift Valley fever is one of the ones that we're very concerned about. Still in Africa, again, this is where it was first identified in this area here in Kenya, and we've seen in the past 15, 20 years big outbreaks all across Africa, South Africa, Egypt, and now into the Middle East as well, with Saudi Arabia and Yemen seeing outbreaks of Rift Valley fever. So again, hard to, almost out of time? Thank you. 5 minutes. Okay, I'll get there. Okay. Yogi Berra is one of my favorite seers because it is true that predictions are very difficult when they involve the future. Climate change is probably one factor for emergence of several different new diseases. The Henipaviruses, the filoviruses, arenaviruses, these are bat-driven and these are rodent-driven. And again, for purposes of time, I'm only going to talk about one disease. But there's, again, more that are going to happen here as a result of all of these different factors. But Hendra is a very interesting virus that first was identified in Australia in 1994 with an outbreak of acute respiratory disease in horses with very high mortality. And then the caregivers of these horses started getting ill as well. And there have been now 7 cases in humans, 4 of whom that have been fatal. A novel virus was identified, and bats were identified as the reservoir species. And what's interesting is that there have been 39 spillover events, all of them involving bat to horse transmission, and the majority of these spillover events have happened since 2011. And so there's an acceleration in the number of cases of Hendra from these bats. These are the natural reservoirs for this. They don't get ill from it, and they're drawn into contact with human due to urban gardens, fruit trees. And what is happening is that global climate change is changing the food distribution, the food availability of these bats. And so they have to go farther and farther out away from their usual habitats in order to find food. And they come in contact with horses because of fruit trees, et cetera, that are planted near the horses, also urban gardens, et cetera. And so the bottom line here is that there's emergence of disease in humans as the result of global climate change. Hendra is one example. Nipah is another very interesting example. There's more evidence about Ebola virus outbreaks happening as a result of changes in bat behavior as well, driven by global climate change. Bats have a huge range of travel, and so there's the possibility that there might be outbreaks of these kinds of diseases throughout their entire flight pattern. So I'm running short on time, so I'll just remind you that there are many, many diseases that we're dealing with, and almost all of them have a global climate change aspect to them that we're dealing with here and throughout the world. So I'll conclude then by thanking you for your attention. I'm going to stick around, obviously, for the panel, and there's lots and lots of questions. I wish I could have talked longer about this because it's an area of intense interest amongst infectious disease specialists. Global climate change has had a profound impact on the emergence of infectious diseases, and that's only going to get more pronounced unless we do more things like having these conferences. So thanks for your attention.
George, thank you very much. We're going to hold questions till the end, and so if you have questions for Dr. Ricci, write them down now so you don't forget them, because you will forget them after we go through these next topics. So think of your questions right now, write them down. Our next topic is going to be the mental health aspects of climate change, and we're lucky to have psychologist Dr. Kevin Dorr present on the mental health.
Good to meet you. Yeah, you too. Thanks. Can you guys hear me okay? Well, it's good to be here. Welcome. I was asked to talk about the mental health or psychosocial impacts of climate change, and so I began to do some research regarding that topic. And it didn't take long for me to be totally freaked out, right? And so I'm going to invite you to be freaked out with me. But actually, I'm going to give you some alarming numbers, but I'm not going to give you that many of them. And one of the reasons for that is one of the things that social scientists have figured out is that if you give people negative information about the effects of climate change, it's actually a demotivator. It's really interesting that that's true. And so you can look at something like your ecological footprint, right? And you can go, oh my gosh, I am doing all these things, biking to work, that sort of thing. But even with the changes in my behavior, we need 2.5 or 3 more planets than we have in order to sustain, the current population, right, acting in the way that I might act. And so there have been some cool things that have shifted regarding that. And one of them, I noticed last week, I was reading an article on what they call ecological handprint. I don't know if you guys know that, but there's actually an app that you can download on your smartphone. And the idea is, and this really is following brain science in terms of what actually motivates people to change. But the idea is that if you engage in sustainable behavior, like Bob, for example, cycling around town, then it increases your handprint. And then if you can affect others, I'm going to use Bob as another example, as a director, or one of the board directors of BWAM, the Bike Walk Alliance in Missoula, he impacts on other people too. And so if he can get other people to change, his handprint gets even bigger, right? And when we look at it that way, we're more motivated to make changes. Now, why is it that negative information doesn't work? One of the reasons, in my view, is because we have 2 operating systems. And this comes from the work of Daniel Kahneman. And Daniel Kahneman is the only psychologist that's ever won a Nobel Prize. And he talks about one operating system in our brain is a really slow, deliberate, analytical, rational operating system. The other one is more immediate, emotional, and instinctually based. As it turns out, almost all the decisions that we make in our life are from this second operating system. And that first operating system corresponds to the narrative or story that you're telling yourself as you're walking through experience, right? And we pretend that we're actually making rational decisions as we move through the day. As it turns out, it's not true. There's thousands of research studies that show that we're not rational beings. And so if you give people information in terms of the effects of our behavior, energy use, and that kind of stuff on climate change, you would think that it would engage the rational part of our brain. We'd go, oh my gosh, we need to make changes. And we would make changes. But it doesn't turn out to be true. That if you really want to affect people's behavior, you have to learn how to speak to the other system. So there's another psychologist by the name of Jonathan Haidt. And Jonathan Haidt is a really cool researcher. He was at the University of Virginia. And his metaphor around this is that the more rational, deliberate system is the rider, and the more immediate, emotionally based system is the elephant. And basically, the elephant is taking us where it wants to go as we're moving through the day. And all the rider is doing is making up post hoc explanations of why the elephant is doing what it's doing, right? And so it's really important that we can kind of ground ourselves and understand, why does the elephant behave in the way that it does? And so I was one of the original directors on the board of BWAM with Bob. And so I was doing all this work in our community around trying to increase infrastructure, like, for example, biking lanes and that sort of thing. So I was really motivated. And I thought, okay, I'm going to start, as part of this process, I'm going to cycle to work every day. We have a wonderful community in that way, right? We have all these bike lanes. It's really easy to do that. And so that was the rider, right? That one operating system is a little bit more rational. It's a good decision. I was motivated to behave in a more sustainable direction. And then I would wake up, and it would be, time was going by, and the elephant took over. And the elephant would basically say, you're not going to do it today, Kevin. Just go ahead and jump in the car, right? And what I would say to myself is, well, I'll do it tomorrow. And we always imagine that our future self is going to behave in a better way than our present self, right? And so my future self is this really magnanimous person that behaves sustainably and all that kind of stuff. And my present self, is pretty much elephant-driven, and it's more based on immediacy. And so what I had to do, understanding how my elephant works, is I took the insurance off my car for a few months. And that was kind of a radical decision. But because I knew my elephant would make decisions every day, and I just wouldn't do it, right? So I took the insurance off my car. And then it allowed me or it forced me actually, it didn't allow me, it forced me to get on my bike. And then after I did it for a few months, then it became my new habit. And once it became my new habit, getting in the car no longer made sense. In part because my sense of belongingness and connection to the community increased tremendously from biking. You know, so I live pretty near the hospital here. My office is near the Hip Strip. So I would bike down Higgins, see people I knew along the way, feel connected to the surroundings, feel the air, you know, see the mountains. I was just so much more connected. And that became reinforcing after a while. After I was able to change behavior for a few months, right? And then once it became a new habit, then I could actually put the insurance back on my car and drive it occasionally. So anyway, let me throw out some numbers just to freak you out a little bit. So Superstorm Sandy, right? It costs over $70 billion, right? In the aftermath of it. But that doesn't include the emotional effects of Superstorm Sandy. So second costliest storm in US history. But if you factor in the emotional or mental health effects, for those areas most affected by Sandy, there were 530,000 new cases of major depression alone. And that's just one of many mental health diagnoses. Katrina, in the aftermath of Katrina, in just the first few weeks, there was a 17% increase in severe or significant mental disorders. And that's in comparison to 1 to 3% in the general population. Over half the population within the first month after Katrina, for example, reported significant symptoms of anxiety. And so these kind of events that are climate related have huge impacts on communities. And then we listen to climate scientists, we get a sense of how this might unfold over the next few generations, right? And so one thing that we know is that with sea levels rising, with more superstorms like Sandy and Katrina, it's very likely that a lot of people are going to be dislocated from their homes. And there's going to be mass migrations going on. And so what that means is that a lot of people are going to lose their connection, their sense of place. And there's going to be a lot of grief, helplessness, a sense of being out of control, and so on that are going to go along with that. And it's going to be tremendously challenging as a human society to respond to that without being totally freaked out. It's very likely that we're going to be totally freaked out as this continues to unfold. I'm already freaked out, right? But as it continues to magnify in its scope and severity, it's very likely that at the basic neurophysiological level, we're going to activate the fight-flight part of our shared neurophysiology. And we activate that part of our shared neurophysiology, we get an uptick in stress hormones like cortisol and norepinephrine. We're very likely to experience emotions like fear and anger, and we're very likely to engage those parts of our shared neurophysiology that have to do with us versus them, where we begin to make all these divisions. We see other people as threats and that kind of stuff, right? And it's going to be so important to be able to cool that off, because to me, the pivotal psychological reality of living in these times is that of uncertainty. We have no idea what's going to happen. And that human beings don't do well with uncertainty. We freak out with it, right? We want to feel like we're in charge or in control. For the first time, for example, if you give surveys to people and you ask them about their children's future, for the first time they say that their children's future is going to be worse than their own life circumstances. And so there's that uncertainty about our children and grandchildren. What's the world going to look like? Will we make it so inhospitable that the earth will no longer be able to hold complex forms of life like humans? And so it's going to be really easy to be freaked out. And what I'd like to do is challenge this group to working both individually and collectively in terms of coming together like we are today, and to learn ways to cool off our neurophysiology so that we can approach this in a much more resilient kind of way. And so this afternoon, they've invited me to talk about resilience, so I'm going to talk more about this afternoon. But how can we engage our resilience? One of the things we know from resilience research is that resilient people reach out to others. They have good connections with other people. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important for us to come together like in groups like today, where we're forming kind of solidarity and connecting with one another. Because there's a competing response to the fight-flight response. In that response, some people call it soothe and connect, or tend and befriend. So in response to trauma or threat, it's possible to drop into that threat-based neurophysiological response, but it's also possible to drop into this tend and befriend response. So we saw it after 9/11, for example. We saw it after Superstorm Sandy, where people came together in this really beautiful way. They were beginning to connect with one another. They were compassionate. They were kind, right? They were offering their time and their services. And so what's cool about our neurophysiology is not only do we have the capacity to be really aggressive and competitive and to be freaked out and to engage that fight-flight neurophysiology, we also have the capacity to be deeply caring and connected and behave compassionately. And to me, that, in terms of a practice that we really need to develop as a human species, that is the practice right there. How can we consciously activate that soothe and connect response? Now, one of the things about the soothe and connect response, in contrast to the fight-flight response, is actually you get a cooling off of your neurophysiology. So when you're acting in compassionate ways, you actually engage the parasympathetic nervous system, or that part of us that allows us to cool off, right? Where our heart rate goes down, that sort of thing, where we're not experiencing emotions like fear and anger. We're experiencing the ability to be deeply caring toward one another. So I would like to invite you guys to think about that just in terms of how can you, as a community, but also as individuals, practice this? Because what we do know from research is that this is dose dependent. I was talking to Patrick about this a few minutes ago, but what I mean by that is that if you practice loving kindness, if you practice a little bit, you will build up those neural structures around loving kindness. If you practice a lot, you'll build them up a lot, right? So individuals who do this a lot, not only are they able to connect better with others and to experience a more loving connection with others, but also it positively impacts on their physical health. So their heart rate goes down, their blood pressure's lower, they're less susceptible to diseases, their immune system gets strengthened. It helps them out at the emotional level. They're more likely to be in trusting connections with others. They're more likely to experience a wide range of positive emotions and so on. But it gives them a lot more flexibility that way too. And the more you do it, the more you'll experience the benefits of that. But my own view on it is that this is going to be essential, though, if we're going to come together as a planet, as a global species, and really tend to one another as some of these events unfold. It's very likely that superstorms like Sandy, not only will we have just one, we might have 2, 3, 4 happening at the same time, within a short period of time. And I think it's really important that we not get too freaked out. So resilient people are really good at connecting with others. And I would suggest that resilience is not only a property of individuals, but it's also a property of neighborhoods, communities, entire societies. That the more resilient we're going to be as a society means it's going to be really important to really focus on how can we come together. And it's really difficult to do that, right? And you even see that in Montana in terms of how do we bring Montanans together around a common purpose. And so I can stand up in front of some groups and I could say I'm a Republican, right? And then half of you would stop listening to me, right? Or I could stand up and say I'm an environmentalist and half of you would be totally checked out, right? These are really tied into these labels and these kind of group identities. And as a result of that, it's really hard for us to have the kind of dialogue that we really need to be able to move things forward. And it's going to be really important that we begin to erase some of those boundaries between us so that we can connect with each other, even if the other person is a Republican, even if the other person is an environmentalist, right? Or maybe especially if they are, and to try to really understand what's going on so we can begin to reach across. And by doing that, you're actually, I talk a lot about this in the community, you actually change the structure and function of your brain through the process of neuroplasticity. right? It's possible to reprogram yourself so that you can feel more connected to others and not rest in these divisions. Now, one of the things we know about the elephant is the elephant thrives on divisions. And the elephant is a very social animal, too. And so, for example, when you're trying to motivate people to behave in more sustainable ways, and if you're talking to the elephant, you really want to focus on things that have a lot of value to the elephant, and part of that is social connections. So there was a study that they did recently where they were looking at energy usage in homes, and they were trying to motivate people to change their behavior, right? To use less energy in their homes. So they tried 4 different tactics. One of them was just to give them the information about the impact high energy had on the planet in terms of contributing to climate change, that kind of stuff, right? Another one was to give them information about what their neighbors were doing. Okay, so your guy next door is using more or less energy than you. Another one is to give them information just in terms of what they could do, just sort of the mechanics of how they can change this, right? Now, if you ask the elephant, if you ask the rider, what's going to most motivate you? What the rider did was the rider said, you know, knowing what my neighbors are doing, that's not going to really change my behavior. What's going to change my behavior is knowing how it impacts on the planet, that kind of stuff. As it turns out, the results were just the opposite. Because the elephant's in charge. The elephant is really concerned about what your neighbor's doing. And the only thing that changed energy usage in that study was being told that your neighbor was lowering their energy usage more than you. And that motivated people to change. And so to me, social science is really important in that way in terms of how do we speak to the elephant more effectively. The other thing about the elephant, too, is the elephant has these deep-seated values or kind of a worldview. And if you can speak to that person's worldview, it makes a huge difference. And I think often, like for example, in the green movement, we're trying to convert everybody to our own worldview, to think in terms of green values. And to me, that's a huge mistake because in responding to climate change, it's going to be really important that we bring a lot of different people together, not only in Montana, the loggers, the ranchers, the environmentalists, and so forth, but think about it worldwide. We have to get everybody on board here. So people from different ethnicities, races, cultural backgrounds, all that kind of stuff. And it's going to be really important that we can speak to the worldviews of everybody involved in order to motivate them, their elephant, to begin to shift so that we can respond to climate change in a more meaningful way. And what I would suggest that instead of trying to convert people over to your way, be able to speak within their own value system. And it's going to be much more motivating than trying to get them to speak the same language that you're speaking. So I'm going to end with just one example, and I'll talk more about this in the afternoon. But Bono, so rock star, right, from U2. As you guys know, he's been really interested in addressing AIDS in Africa. And so when George Bush was president, he was connecting with a lot of people, including Jesse Helms. And Jesse Helms, as you guys might recall, was a senator, and maybe one of the most conservative senators in the history of the Senate. And he was connected with people like Franklin Graham, a really popular, well-known evangelical speaker. And Bono, instead of trying to talk like a rock star and speaking from his own worldview, he was able to connect with Jesse Helms and Franklin Graham and other key players in ways where he was connecting with their value system. And so part of the value system that he was connecting with was the religious background in terms of being Christian and trying to promote those values in the world. So he talked a lot about AIDS in terms of if Jesus was alive, what would he be doing? Right? So AIDS is kind of leprosy of the day in Bono's view. And he was able to connect with Franklin Graham and Jesse Helms around that idea. And it resonated for their elephant. It resonated for them. And Bono was doing it in a really respectful way, too. And as it turns out, I mean, you guys probably know the history of this, but that is a feather in the cap of the Bush administration, was they released a lot of money for AIDS relief in Africa. And they had Jesse Helms and all these other people involved in doing that. In fact, after Bono was able to connect with Jesse Helms, if you can believe this, came to his concert. So he's there rocking out with you too, right? I mean, who would have predicted that, right? But the way that happened, though, was by slipping outside his worldview and connecting with others. And I would suggest that that's going to be really important if we're going to be able to move our public discourse forward. I'll end on that. Thanks, Chief.
Kevin, thank you for that very important message. And we will be practicing that for the rest of our lives, or at least for today. So our next speaker, Dr. Phyllis Ide, will be talking about community health impacts. Phyllis?
This is on. Maybe I'll use this. The first thing I want to put up here is just news you can use. This is going to be a town hall meeting being held in Portland, Oregon this coming week. And Portland, I'm from Spokane. Portland from Spokane is far, from Missoula farther. So this is a great way to tie in by YouTube, either on the day of or archived afterward. This is a report on the National Climate Assessment that's been going on the past year. It's an effort that occurs every so many years, and it's, I think, a really good compendium of information that's up to date and would be very interesting for you to take a look at. Along with that, I would say, too, that there is a series of Northwest climate change conferences that have been happening since 2010. The first one was in Portland, the second one Seattle, last year Boise, so you can kind of do the math. It's going to be back somewhere in Oregon this coming year, and I would recommend that one to you as well. But let me start by saying a little bit about who I am, because you're probably wondering, who is this person and why is she up here? Well, first of all, I'm up here because of my student, Beth Schenk, who is one of our outstanding PhD students at WSU in Spokane. And she very kindly invited me to this gathering, and I've been very impressed last night, today, and so forth. My background is that I've always been sensitized to climate and issues of climate. I look around and I can kind of figure out we're probably most of us in the boomer age, except for this side of the room. Not so much, the boomer age. And you might remember where you were or what you were doing in 1970 during the first Earth Day. I was like in junior high or early high school, and it really made an impact. It was kind of one of those, what we call sensitive periods, where you get imprinted on things. And I seemed to imprint on that, and it just always stayed in the back of my mind that, you know, we have our environment, but someday it may not be this way. The water may go down, the air may get worse, et cetera. And back then, the air was really bad. You know, you remember those stories of LA and New York and so forth. Fast forward to the 80s and 90s, I had a great opportunity to move to Hawaii and live there for 20 years. And during that time, I did a dual degree in nursing and public health. And my field work for public health was in Micronesia. And that was in 1985. And one of the takeaway messages that I always keep in my mind is that the capital of the Marshall Islands is Majuro. And Majuro's highest point is a bridge. It is a very flat volcanic atoll that's so old that it's all worn down. And it's not a high island, it's a low island. So when you think about these island nations kind of around the equator, the Maldives comes to mind, et cetera, as was stated previously by Dr. Patz, there's a lot of social justice issues. The least able to deal with this, the most vulnerable populations, are the most affected by the things that the high latitude people have done. So I just wanted to say that's a very important thing to keep in mind. And then for whatever reason, in 2009, it was Earth Day again. Maybe it was some sort of anniversary. I just remember it came back to my mind. I decided to make a deliberate effort to go out and get some information and become more knowledgeable about climate change. So I got on the interwebs and Googled the word, you know, climate change, education, what have you. As it happened, that was the very first year that University of Washington was doing this one-year climate decision-making for global climate change certificate. And I was very fortunate to be in that inaugural class. And I am here to tell you I was the only healthcare professional in that class. It was a bunch of lawyers, engineers, civic engineers, etc., people who were interested in infrastructure and the legalities and so on and so forth. So since that time, I've been going to these conferences, and very often what I get is people going, why is nursing interested in climate change? And to me, it's like, hello, it's really obvious. And I think I am speaking to the choir here when I say it's pretty darn obvious. But I'm also here to tell you that when you're in with a bunch of climatologists who are interested in Arctic ice cores and tree rings and things of that nature, it can be a little bit harder of a sell. So just wanted to say that. So looping back, I would recommend this to you for the latest and greatest. I know that that's also published elsewhere, so if you Google the words Northwest Climate Assessment, that will probably bring up that information. And with that, let's go to our slides. And I will be frank that I did this one, I'm repurposing my slides. I did this at the 4th International Climate Change Conference in Seattle last year, and so I was trying to make the case why nursing. So hopefully I can be accurate with that here too. So I'm going to try and skip over the things so that it's not repetitive. If George Bush was the decider, I'd like to see my role as the elaborator. So hopefully I can elaborate on a few things. Here you'll see some statements from the Lancet about how climate change is the biggest global health threat in the 21st century. World Health Organization making a statement in 2009. And also I would point out, trying to connect in the public health aspect, that one of the major linkages that I see is that a huge predictor of health is one's socioeconomic status. And if your socioeconomic status is that of being a rancher, a farmer, a fisherman, all of those industries have the potential to be strongly influenced by climate change. So right away in the bottom line, you will see an impact for those folks. And right now I'm going to do a little sidebar because I found something online I thought was kind of a little shocking, actually. Who in this room knows who Timothy Egan is? Timothy Egan is an author who is pretty famous in the Northwest. He's written about major fires in the early 1900s. He's written about the Dust Bowl. He has a regular column in the New York Times. Just the other day, I was scanning through the New York Times website. They do have a good series of articles on climate change. But this particular article really struck me a little sideways. And maybe you'll agree with me when I read the title of that article. And again, this is by Timothy Egan. Hicks, Nix, Climate Fix. I'll read that again. Hicks, Nix, Climate Fix. Obviously, he's doing a little takeoff on the Variety headlines of yore that are kind of witty and compressed. And basically, it was all about why don't farmers support Obama's efforts to do climate change? But I want to tee off some of the socio-political, economic discourse we've been having, and that is, do you think a farmer who would read that headlines would read any farther? No. I was really quite appalled. And I wrote a comment, so I'm one of the hundreds or whatever that wrote a comment and said, I think you're speaking to the echo chamber. He talked in his article about the artisanal radish raisers in Portland and Brooklyn and so on. I said, well, if you're talking to that echo chamber, you're doing a great job. But you're not going to reach the farmers. They're going to just not read that article. So kind of for shame. That goes to the whole issue of how do we communicate about climate change. Who here has engaged in a debate, or let's call it a discussion, about climate change with somebody who doesn't believe what you believe? Pretty much 90%. And could it be that that person started that discussion, maybe knowing of your situation or where you're coming from, and perhaps saying, oh, right, climate change, we just had a major blizzard on the East Coast, right? So how do you come back from that? Or do you want to come back from that? So I'll let you think about that while I take a sip. Well, one thing is, don't forget the word global. It can be snowing up a storm in the Northeast in the United States, which is what percentage of the globe? Many places in the globe elsewhere are experiencing drought. It's called what I like to call in my backyard, not in my backyard, but in my backyard. We judge things according to what's in our backyard, whether that be my backyard in Spokane, Washington, or my backyard in the Northwest, or even my backyard in the United States. But my backyard is not the globe. The globe is a much bigger place. The other thing I wanted to, and I'm kind of departing a little bit from this, is to give you a couple of references that you can kind of look up on your own. One is a study that was called The Six Americas. That was done in a collaboration between Yale and George Mason University. And one of the lead authors, George Maybach, did a webinar through APHA, which is the Public Health Association. And in that study, they surveyed roughly 2,000 people in the Northeast. And what they found when they got the results of that survey was the results segmented it pretty nicely into 6 different categories in a range, from the true believers to the really not going to believe it people. And the nice part about that study was it gave you ideas about how to toe into a discussion with those folks who really didn't believe it at all. And it turns out, in many cases, the way in on that is economic. So money talks. And when you were discussing about how you get people engaged with doing energy changeover, the one thought that came to my mind was rebates. Right? So in Spokane, Avista has been giving a fairly good number of rebates. And I think that has gotten people to think about, well, maybe I'll get a more energy efficient refrigerator, because guess what? I can get $100 back. And maybe they'll haul it away, the old one. So rebates, so money sometimes can talk. The other person I would recommend to your research is not in climatology. He's not in public health, but he is in linguistics. And his name is George Lakoff, L-A-K-O-F-F. His work has been in linguistics, talking about the frames, what he calls the frames, that are activated when people say certain words. So he does a lot on the political discourse, left, right, Republican, Democrat, and so forth. What frame is activated when certain words are used. So if you think about engaging that challenging conversation with somebody about climate change, the very words climate change are probably activating a frame in that person's mind, and already you've got an uphill fight on your hand. Well, not fight, an uphill challenge on your hand. So maybe some ways that you can approach the conversations that would give you a little bit of a softer landing on that would be, first of all, to say, you know what? I understand that without greenhouse gases, life would not exist as we know it on this earth. And that is true. Greenhouse gases gets a bad rap that it's all bad. But without greenhouse gases, it would be very, very cold, and we could not exist. The other is, you could throw out a fun fact. Did you know that water vapor is a greenhouse gas? So that might, slow things down to where you can actually engage in a conversation about things that may lead to a common understanding. And one of the ways that we can lead towards a common understanding is to work towards what are called no-regrets solutions. So that if we do more bike paths and we do more support of public transportation, it's like, well, it may impact, it would impact global warming, but it has the co-benefit of helping people be more active, maybe saving a bunch of money, because in many places it's not just the gas to drive the car, it's parking. Maybe not so much in Missoula, but certainly if you go to Seattle or Portland, downtown parking is plenty expensive. So again, you kind of hear a little recurrent theme, recourse to the pocketbook. Those arguments may come to a little bit more of the fore. The whole $49 versus $30, those kind of issues also get to the pocketbook issues. I think we've talked a lot about the pathways of climate change and health, but we certainly are seeing a lot on direct effects such as temperatures that are rising, increased frequency and duration of heat waves, and so on. Here's some public health issues I think that we all can understand. It's not only heat waves, it's not only in the summer and et cetera, it's also that we don't get a lot of relief at nighttime during a heat wave. I don't know about you here in Missoula, but in Spokane, at least in the last 10 years I've been there, it's been great. I've actually took out my air conditioner when I first moved into my house, because you really don't need it except for maybe a few weeks a year. But at nighttime, if you have a window fan, it's just like having an air conditioner, because it gets so nice and cool at night. But one of the challenges is going to be if that nighttime temperature does not drop, if it stays like pretty close, there is no physiological relief from the heat. And that can be a real issue and challenge. So, talking about my peeps, public health nurses, what can we do? We know the vulnerable populations. We work with them, the elderly, the young, the vulnerable from chronic disease and so forth. People need to strengthen their network. They have to have people that they know of. One of the issues with the big, I think it was 1995 heat wave in Paris, it was during the month August when a lot of people go out of town on vacation. A lot of elders were left on their own, and they didn't have a strong support network. And so there was a lot of deaths attributed to that. So how can we strengthen our infrastructure? How can we be aware of people who need to be looped in and kept in touch when we have these natural disasters? There are indirect effects, water shortage during drought, increase in transmission. We've heard a lot about that today. I just wanted to say a word really quickly, and whoever's keeping time, just wave the flag when you need to. I will certainly make my slides available if we don't get through all of them, so please rest assured. I want to just say that I think in the latter half of the 21st century, water will be as strong a currency as oil. And we're going to see more and more trouble, and I hate to say this after the last speaker, but more and more national vying for the sources of water and the commodification of water. Already we're seeing, movement on the Himalayan sources of major rivers like the Ganges and the Yellow River. China making efforts to secure the headwaters. Who controls the headwaters is going to control the flow. If you think of all the people downriver from the Himalayas, that is millions and millions of people. So there is a reason why one of the first federal agencies to really get on board with climate change and really start drilling into that was the Pentagon, because it is a safety and security issue. And exactly what I was saying there, certainly we can see issues related to interruptions in food and water and so forth. Now a little bit of a blurb for Florence. Florence Nightingale, our first nurse, was also one of the very first epidemiologists. We've also had, in the fairly recent past, some publication of principles of environmental health. There are certainly some nursing groups that are becoming more active, and I believe Beth is a member of one of those. Healthcare Without Harm is some of the others. This is going back to the issue of this conference, building bridges, not widening the crevasse. Nursing, I make the plug, is one of the most trusted health professions and certainly can serve as a bridging agent. However, I will say that when I've done my literature review, I have to give kudos to my public health colleagues who are very well published in climate change and health. Nursing, not as much, so I hope we can see that catch-up start to happen. We work in a lot of arenas, not just acute care, but we're out in the communities, we're in occupational health, we're in parish health, there's another sort of thing, hospice. These are all dealing with people who have serious health issues, but they're not in the supportive environment of a hospital. They're having to manage and deal with things at home, so these services have to come in. So here are some roles of nurses that are, I think, very congruent with climate change. Advocacy, being able to speak up on behalf of folks. Coalition building, we're really versed in doing that. Community organizing and social marketing, policy development and enforcement, and so forth. This is from the Minnesota Department of Health. They've done a lot of really great work in elaborating the roles of public health nurses. I think I'm going to pause there and just go off the reservation a little bit, so to speak, and talk about things that I found very startling to me when I did that 4-course sequence. And I will recommend it to anybody who would like to deepen your understanding of climate change. It's all online, and it was on adaptation, business, science, and law. And so it was very well-rounded. Here are some things I found really interesting. The poles are warming faster than the equator. Now, I would have thought the other way around. You know, the pole's closer to the sun. But no, the poles are warming faster. So what does that mean? We've got ice and snow floating. We have ice and snow on a continent. That's respectively the Arctic and the Antarctic. So when you have areas where snow and ice are melting off of land, that is actually adding to the rise of the sea level. It's also changing the salinity of the sea level, of the sea. If you think about it, the currents that keep the UK and Scotland and Ireland nice and warm comparatively, much warmer than their counterpart in Moscow, that could slow down or even shut down in worst case scenario if that dense salty water becomes infused with a lot of fresh water from melting glaciers and snow. Concrete. I had no idea that concrete was a major linkage to climate change and carbon emissions. Many, many countries around the world are not only having population, of course, increase, but I would call it aspirational. They're very aspirational in their goals for their people. Think back in 1970 when Nixon went to China. Do you remember those pictures of the thoroughfares in China with 20 bike lanes across, just jammed with bikes? Fast forward to now, and you take a picture of the same place, it's cars, wall to wall. They're aspirational. They're not going to agree that their people are going to be on bikes for the rest of their lives. So that is a major challenge for us. And with that, I think I will close and just say that we have many challenges in communicating about climate change. I think one of the things we need to do is, as much as possible, be known to each other. For scientists to be known to the public, not just as scientists in their ivory tower, but as people who care. And why do you care? What got you into this? What was the seminal events that caused you to want to really drill into this? I think when people know that about you, they'll respect more and will perhaps be more willing to listen to what you have to say. So again, thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Bill. And if Kevin, if you can come up front, we're about, sorry, we're about 8 to 10 minutes behind schedule. So Beth, you can cut off the questions whenever you want, because we do have still Nikki Fear to bring up before lunch. She's the only one between you and lunch. Sorry, Nikki. Anyway, so if you have a question for any of our 3 panelists, please come up to the microphone and fire away. Go ahead.
Hi. I thank Dr. Eide for talking about frames, because that really helps me coalesce my ideas of how to approach people. But I am going to address this to Dr. Dorr, because he's local here and he can understand some of the challenges that we have. I work with Transition Missoula, and in our conversation and even trying to put together our own vision statement, trying to decide if we want to use the word global warming, we've had our own challenges of wanting to have it included or not included, because we want to embrace people in the Bitterroot, people in Kalispell who certainly don't have an agreement. They have an agreement of things that are happening, but they don't have an agreement on terminology. And so because Dr. Dorr is local, and I hope that maybe we can get you to come talk to our group at some point in time, that would be awesome, is how can we change or reframe the term climate change or global warming to engage people in Missoula who otherwise might reject those words and thus reject our desire to bring our community together and move forward as a sustainable community. People out in Target Range are farmers, but they may not accept this terminology so that we can work together. So I put that out to you to ask you what words we can use and how we can open that conversation.
Okay, that's a great question. I would begin by saying that my grandmother was the most ardent environmentalist I've ever known. But if you would have called her an environmentalist, she would have really resisted that, right? But she was an environmentalist from the standpoint that she composted, she grew a lot of food on her land. Her energy usage was really low by today's standards. And so what I would suggest is that everyone is motivated to take care of the environment, not just environmentalists or people as part of the green movement. And that's why it's really important that you frame your messages in ways that will resonate with the rural view of your target audience. And understanding, as you were pointing out too, what's going to motivate them. So for some people, they're going to be motivated around human health and promoting the health for their children, as an example. Other people will be motivated for economic reasons. As I was suggesting earlier, if you're speaking to the elephant is inherently a social animal and will be motivated to be part of some kind of group identity. So as you can begin to build group identities around sustainable behavior, that's going to be really important. But you want to be really careful, though, in terms of avoiding, like you say, some of the labels and terms that are going to be demotivators for a lot of groups. The other thing that I would just briefly say, too, is that if you look at the history of Montana, and so, for example, when they formed the Constitution here in Montana in the 1970s, to me it's an incredible environmental document. I mean, it begins by talking about the importance of protecting our health, right? And our right to a clean environment. And if you go back in time and you look at how many environmental groups were present in Montana during the writing of that Constitution, there's only one environmental group in Montana at that time. And now in Montana, I mean in Missoula alone, we have dozens. And so it was a broad coalition of ranchers and loggers and miners and so forth that came together to write that document. And unfortunately, in my view, our public discourse has really taken a decline since then, and we get caught up in these labels that divide us. And so in that way, I totally resonate with what you're saying, that as your group begins to try to message itself to the community, it's going to be really important to avoid those labels that you know are going to be demotivators, and to use terms that will allow people to come together and coalesce as a community.
Well, this is also a comment about Transition Missoula, which was just mentioned, and that is the idea about how do you start getting neighbors and communities to work together to be more resilient. And there was a great lesson learned from Transition New Zealand after the big earthquake that devastated Christchurch. The transition people had put together a time bank of all the people who could do various kinds of skills so that they could trade their skills and so on. And after that emergency, that time bank was used to mobilize the neighborhood to help people start rebuilding and help each other and so on. And it just took off everybody's interest in transition, that they had help people to cooperate together and deal with an emergency. So we decided a good thing for Transition Missoula to do was to work on neighborhood emergency preparedness. It was kind of a first way to reach out to people. Sure, you want to help your neighbors in an emergency, right? And as you learn who lives in your neighborhood, where the elderly people are, like you said, and maybe somebody becomes the specialist in how are we going to treat our drinking water if all of a sudden we can't have clean drinking water. We need to have people who know how to do that. And we're going to work together and share our skills and so on. And also just the governor's office created something called Serve Montana, which provides kits on how to do neighborhood emergency preparedness planning. And so get that and hold a potluck and get your neighbors together, and people will come together over helping each other in an emergency, and then maybe they'll willing to do more after that. So the next university district meeting on March 27th is going to be about emergency preparedness and starting to get people within their neighborhood to work, maybe street by street in preparing for that. And if you know your neighbors that way, then maybe you're willing to cooperate in other ways and work on urban gardening together and so on and so forth. So I thought that was a good way to appeal to the elephant, right?
Absolutely.
Now I see a bunch more people, and we're kind of running out of time, so if you can keep your comments or questions brief, that'd be great.
Yes. Synchronicity. I actually was going to mention the same thing. Transition Missoula we're in the talking stage of forming these emergency neighborhood preparedness potlucks. The other thing is, at the end of this conference, I feel this urge to have a meeting right afterwards to, I'm specifically thinking of using the MCAT recording of this conference and what you have been saying, and having it like at the Wilma, maybe with Kevin Dorr as the moderator, and Jan Holm mentioned tagging it onto a movie that would really bring people in. So I hope we'll have time to do some planning. Thanks.
What do you see as transitions that the medical field needs to take to address the coming challenges? Do we need to change our medical infrastructure? Do we need to change our medical education? Do we need to change how we're thinking about what healthcare is in society? So how do we address sort of the public health, the individual health, and that infrastructure of health with these coming challenges?
Oh, and they all look at me.
Sorry, that was to everyone.
I'll take a whack, and then I'm sure the others will too. I certainly think with the healthcare reforms that we're seeing start to roll in, they're not totally in yet, there is a movement to preventative care and health promotion. And part of that certainly goes to diet, and that can link straight back to less eating of feedlot-raised meat and so forth. So I think, it's not just one thing, it's like the web of life, so to speak. I think medical education has become more sensitive to those issues. Certainly nursing is as well, but I also think that one comment I'd like to make is that disaster preparedness is something we've always had with us. We've always had floods, we've always had heat waves, it's not an asteroid from outer space. So I think sometimes people get a sense that climate change is, something new. And it is in the sense that we're pushing natural systems along a lot faster. But that could be part of the education, is how do people communicate to the public? And I think scientists need a lot of work on that, and I think sometimes regarding public health we need some assistance with that too.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The disconnect between what is known, the knowledge base, and the general public at large just continues to get larger and larger. And one of the major obligations, I think, of the healthcare community is bridging that gap, and that, by having these kinds of forums where we talk about these kinds of issues, where disease prevention can be accomplished by a variety of fairly low-tech, easy solutions. So that's probably the major one. The other is the market is what drives an awful lot of decisions. And I think if all of us stopped buying our groceries and meat especially in places where we know that antibiotics are being used, where we know that hormones are being used, et cetera, then the market's going to respond to that. The kinds of things that are even in mouthwash and toothpaste, et cetera, antibiotics are in them for no good medical reason. And if we stop using them, then the effects on the microbiome are going to become much more manifest. But as long as we continue to buy whatever is the cheapest, then that's going to be that's not going to happen.
And that's even expanding beyond the health sector, of course, and there's sustainable farming in Brazil now, that's certified, people buying certified sustainable products. I think that has a very strong impact. Last question, and then I think we're going to have to go to our next speaker.
I'll be really quick here. If you want to have a conversation with an elephant, go to the legislature. We just were up there recently. It's a very simple bill, simply that Montana recognized that climate change is real. There were maybe 20 speakers. They included several farmers, a commercial fisherman, people that lived, I believe, in the health world also, and equal time was given to 4 or 5 people, most of them from the mining industry or looked to be a professional denier. So denial is alive and well, and we're just going to have to deal with this and get through it. That thing got tabled in spite of all the good testimony, and trying to reach people from all different aspects. We did not identify ourselves as environmentalists. Other people said, well, we're farmers. I'm a fisherman, whatever. That didn't get anywhere because we were labeled by the opposition. So it's just something that we're going to have to deal with, and hopefully we can find a good way to do this on a national level. One of the representatives there said, maybe this isn't the right venue. Maybe you should go right to the president. So put that in here.
And I just want to say really quickly that one thing I think everyone in this room can do is call the media every single time the false equivalency comes up. You've got one person for speaking of the reality of climate change and one person that speaks against it. That is not representative. It's like this, right? But the way the media presents it, they will seek to find somebody who will speak on the other side. And that is a false equivalency. That perpetuates the notion that this is not settled science. Look, there's another person speaking against it. So I think we just have to be really careful and call the media on that when that happens.
Thank you.
And that goes way across climate change to a lot of other areas as well, where there's a lot of interest generated by creating controversy. And so you try and have fair and balanced, if you will, which is not fair and balanced at all, because it does give credibility to people who really should not have the same forum. And that goes whether you're talking about the people who are anti-vaccine or the people who believe climate change is not real. These are pseudo-scientific arguments that have no place in the media, and the more the media allows these people to have a good forum, the more harm we're doing.
And I just have to slide in the quote from Daniel Patrick Moynihan. You're entitled to your own opinion, but not to your own facts.
And that's a great thing to end on. That wraps up this panel, and thank you very much for the great dialogue as well. So there's one more speaker before lunch. No one leave yet? Beth?
Thank you so much. Thank you all. That was terrific and loaded with information. I want to talk with you all more. This was our deep dive just now into health impacts, and already you all are thinking so much about solutions, which is wonderful. And also this really difficulty of talking, just like you mentioned, Harold, right now. So we're switching our focus a bit now to really start to talk about that challenge of discussion. And we're doing it intentionally before lunch, partly so you will talk about it over lunch. And so, however, lunch is ready, and just to get your appetites whetted, it's a vegetarian, primarily locally sourced, high-quality food that you're going to have today. So look forward to that in about a half an hour. But first, we're going to hear from Nikki Fear, and you can read in your papers about Nikki's experience and her commitment. And she's been a long-time student and scientist of climate change impacts. You don't know from what's written there that she also has led bicycle tours around the world that raises awareness of climate change. One other fact that I'm sure you don't know is that she also has a very mean wrist shot. I have defended her many times in hockey. She's a wonderful person and brings great energy and good balance to this discussion, so I'm really looking forward to hearing what she's been studying in her doctoral program too.
Great. Thank you, Beth. There's a lot of mutual affection between the two of us, and I think we should all give Beth Schenk some round of applause here. Thank you. She is quite amazing with her own vision for this conference, bringing together people from spiritual perspectives, mental health, physical health, scientists, to talk about this connection. Public health is increasingly an access point for people to motivate people on climate change. So thank you, Beth and Georgia Milan and others for putting this together. So I am the only thing between you and lunch right now, so please stick with me. And I'm going to be like the woman, the Jewish woman last night talked about. I'll just try to speak faster to go through what I'm going to talk about. I was asked to talk about the challenge of discussion, and to talk about the challenge, I first want to say that talk about the importance of discussion on climate change. There was an interesting article that came out in Nature a few months ago that said that the real questions right now have less to do with our lack of understanding in the geophysics of the planet in terms of how increasing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are going to play out on the planet. Most of our uncertainty in terms of the future conditions of the planet are not based in science, but lack of understanding about what humans will do or will not do to reduce our emissions. And so the real questions come down to a human component and the social side of this issue. So what I want to talk about today are 3 dimensions of that social side, and what we can think about and hold in our awareness and understanding that this issue really brings together a multitude of challenges that are political, cultural, and psychological. And then have us be thinking and move forward about what does this mean for crossing divides and moving forward on collective action on climate change. This was already mentioned before, and I'll show the visual here about the 6 Americas. This has been an interesting study, consecutive studies that were, Tony Lazarowitz out of Yale's Project in Climate Change Communications and others have been surveying Americans for several years to ask them about their concern about climate change. And it turns out we don't all think the same about the issue. We line up, as he points out, in 6 Americas, ranging from those who are alarmed, probably most people in this room see it as a clear and present danger and are actively working right now to try to address it. People who are concerned see it as a problem, but they're not as actively engaged, maybe see the challenges playing out further in the future. The cautious people are really confused. They're not exactly sure if it's human caused or not. The disengaged haven't really even thought about it very much. The doubtful people see if it is warming, they're not sure. They think that's more attributed to natural causes. The dismissive people say, actually, this is not happening. The ideas about climate change are a hoax and generated by liberal scientists. Unfortunately, that perspective is, as we heard, very represented in Congress. What's interesting here, that shows you the results from 2008. And what you'll see is the difference between 2008 and 2009 in those percentages of people in each of those populations. What you can see is the number of people the percentage who were alarmed went down in those 3-year period from 18 to 12%. Concerned went down from 33 to 27%, while those on the other end of the spectrum, those who are doubtful and dismissive, went up in numbers. So there's a question about what happened in those few years there. And I will note, too, though, just most recently, the study came out from data from September of 2012, which shows our numbers are swinging back up to see more people who are, I don't know how to get them, alarmed, back up to almost the numbers of 2008, and fewer dismissive. But what happened between 2008 and 2011? Well, if you haven't seen yet, there's a really interesting report that came out through PBS, Frontline Climate of Doubt, that tells a story about what generated the massive shift in public opinion. In 2008, the IPCC report had just come out that showed very compelling evidence about the human link to global warming, about the real risks that it presents. We passed a bill in the House nationally through the Waxman-Markey bill that put forward a cap-and-trade mechanism to bring down emissions. We're moving forward at the global level in Copenhagen to come up with a global agreement about bringing down emissions. But then things really stalled out, and we never passed a bill in the Senate. The global agreements really broke down. And a lot of people have been pointing out that there was a concerted effort by certain groups to instill doubt about the scientific link between human activity and global warming. Naomi Orcheskas wrote an interesting book with Eric Conway, many of you have probably heard of, titled Merchants of Doubt: How a Handful of Scientists Obscured the Truth on Issues from Tobacco Smoke to Global Warming. So this very similar tactics was used to create doubt about climate change as was used to create doubt about the link between secondhand smoke and lung cancer. And the thinking was, you don't necessarily need to lie, but if you create just enough doubt about the link, it gives people rationale for not promoting policies to shift their behavior. Why stop smoking if we're not sure that's going to harm our health? Why stop using fossil fuels, which generate a really great economy and way of life for us, if we're not really sure it's harming the planet? So as Harold pointed out, these doubts are still alive and well across the nation. In our legislature, I was watching a hearing just a few weeks ago. This happened on February 18th. Mike Phillips, a Democrat out of Bozeman, put forward Senate Bill 281, which basically just said the DEQ should work with the University of Montana's Climate Office to assimilate the best available information about climate trends and disseminate that to people across Montana so they can plan. So farmers can plan in terms of what is projected, the variability projected on the land. DEQ can plan and create a biannual report. Well, this is what we heard from other senators on that Natural Resources Committee. Senator John Brennan, again, these were the same kinds of doubts that you hear about in the Frontline report. Well, actually, in 2007 to 2009, when Professor Running came to talk with us about climate change, he said that 2,000 peer-reviewed people believed in climate change. Did you know that 20,000 scientists, also peer-reviewed, disputed that report? And you hear this a lot among the doubters. Then Senator Verdell Jackson spoke about how he spent the summer reading basically a wheelbarrow full of books. He got very educated on the issue, and what he found is there's no scientific evidence to link the connection between greenhouse gases and warming. In fact, the best evidence is that the warming, if there is due to sunspots. So, yeah, it is kind of, what's interesting is these differences in belief frequently line up along political divides. You can see Democrats and Republicans here. And again, this is reflected in across the nation. Americans still differ on if global warming is happening and what is causing the warming. Complicated slide here, but you can kind of see the difference here between liberals, moderates, and conservatives. Is there solid evidence that the Earth is warming? Most liberals say yes, it's warming. Conservatives, only 43% think that there is warming. What's causing it? Most liberals, people are divided on the causes, but you can see most think it's because of human activity. Liberals are pretty sure that's what it is. Very few conservatives think that it's because of human activities, and more, if it is happening, think it's due because of natural activities. I'm sorry, natural patterns. And so it's very interesting to think, like, what is driving some of this difference? And what I noticed with Mike Phillips' presentation of that bill was that he was quite sure that if he could just educate the different representatives on the committee, that once they saw the link and they understood the science, that then they would agree that it was happening and would pass this policy. Yes, we should move forward on it. But what's interesting is that there's really not a link between scientific literacy and education and belief on climate change. There's an interesting study that Dan Kahan has done called The Tragedy of, as part of his the Cultural Cognition Project, again at Yale. And he's found that cultural values have a bigger effect on perception of climate change risk than does scientific literacy. And this is a little bit complicated, but here's what he predicted in a study. We know there's a difference between conservatives and liberals in terms of sense of risk of climate change, where we've seen that in the polls. These two different categories kind of are about the worldviews of conservatives versus liberals, and that's a very broad generalization I could get into more later, but for the sake of time right now, individualists tend to be from more of a kind of conservative value based, egalitarians a bit more liberal. And so perception of risk, you would predict, as people who are more scientifically literate, better capacity to deal with numbers, even if they're of a conservative value, you would predict that they would have a higher sense of perceived risk of climate change. What he actually found was when you look at people who are more scientifically literate, people who are of this conservative value actually have less of a sense of perceived risk of climate change. So smart people, getting back to that Senator Verdell, he read a wheelbarrow full of books right over the summer, but he read books that tended to confirm his pre-existing ideas about what's going on with the planet. And it's this tendency that Kevin Dorr was talking about, that we tend to be very much rationalizing people rather than rational people. And we all have this tendency towards confirmation bias. So I've been very interested in this conversation about co-benefits, that, well, even if we move towards a more sustainable society with bike lanes and renewable energy, it will be a lot of co-benefits for all of us. And Ginny and some of you others were a part of an interesting city council hearing about a year ago when we were deciding about whether we would continue to support our membership as a city in ICLEI. ICLEI is an organization that helps governments do climate action planning. And what was interesting is that there was a lot of people who came to protest the city's membership in ICLEI. And I was really, and then, here we go. And this kind of protest around kind of local sustainability initiatives and planning has been happening in other communities around the nation. So here was an article in the New York Times last year that said, across the country, activists with ties to the Tea Party are rallying against all sorts of things, all sorts of local and state efforts to control sprawl and energy. They brand government action for things like expanding public transportation routes and preserving open space as part of a UN-led conspiracy to deny property rights and herd citizens towards cities. They're showing up at planning meetings to denounce bike lanes on public streets and smart meters on home appliances, efforts they equate with big government blueprint against individual rights. And you might look at this as I did and think, crazy, right? And I left this meeting with my liberal friends and went next door to Sean Kelly's, and we sat around and talked about how crazy those people were that were saying all these things. And then I kind of caught myself back to Kevin Dorr's point about kind of demonizing the other and thinking our worldview is the right view. And I decided I wanted to look a little bit more deeply into what was going on here. And so I took the opportunity to actually analyze the comments from those who spoke in opposition to the ICLEI funding and those who spoke in favor of it. And what was interesting, and maybe not so surprisingly based on what I said earlier, is that the people who spoke in opposition to the Climate Action Planning Initiative basically had their perception of climate change consistent with the doubting perspectives, that there's no proof that man has caused climate change, science is not settled, it's a lie, science can be manipulated to prove an ideology, conflicting knowledge about this topic is barred from discussion. If it's not happening, there's no need to waste money on ICLEI. Perception that ICLEI funding, if we start to allow for these localized planning efforts, will result in a loss of freedoms. It's a threat to our private property rights. Will stifle economic growth. It's a slippery slope towards poverty. Local government will fall under the control of the federal government. There's a hidden agenda by United Nations Agenda 21. And we talked a little bit about the Rio meetings. Agenda 21 is a real thing. In 1992 in the Rio conferences, there really was 178 nations that agreed that sustainability is a good thing. There was non-binding though. But there's a concern that is really a threat to a particular worldview, that the right way to kind of run society is to kind of support individual rights and freedoms, and that if we see, whether it's UN or government interfering with those individual rights, it's seen as very much a threat to one's way of life and to what we value. So in contrast, people who were in support of climate action, very much from the believer side of the climate change issue, climate change is real, driven by humans, we're already seeing impacts to the environment, need to reduce emissions, and need transition. Here we go, the transition towns, right? Away from fossil fuel. This planning tool provides a useful model for to think about how we bring down emissions collectively, allows for a planned transition to a new society and economy. and investment in sustainability and livable planet. We've heard these kind of comments here a lot today, right? And what I found interesting in thinking about this from the perspective of someone who might feel very threatened by those comments is when we talk about the world and the future world in those ways, it's very much shuts down a certain segment of people that we might think, wow, we are presenting a vision for the world that's going to be good for everyone. You know, these are very much values that are part of like an egalitarian worldview, but they're very threatened to people who come from a more individualistic kind of worldview. Jonathan Haidt, is Kevin Dorr still here? Where did he go? I loved his talk. So he and I think kind of read some of the same people. Jonathan Haidt did a great, actually, interview with Bill Moyers, was where I got introduced to him. He had a great interview. It was about this book that I also read called The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. And he talks about this tendency to kind of be very groupish. You know, groupishness really helps with our survivability, and it brings us a lot of joy. But at the same time, through our groupishness, we also can tend to kind of like find differences and ultimately demonize the other. And what he talks about very well in his book is that actually all these different perspectives can provide valuable insights to how we solve our biggest challenges, including climate change. And what he talks about there in his book is that, you know, liberals really very much contribute an important vision to the climate issue. Corporations, on their own nature, are very much prone towards growth and overextending themselves. And government really is an important regulator, and actually the most essential regulator of corporations. That said, libertarians have a lot to contribute to how we move through this problem, because individual ingenuity and entrepreneurship actually can drive the economy and help us find solutions to generating new forms of energy, for example. And conservatives, where they're focused more on kind of morality. Morality is very important for controlling humans and our kind of tendency towards kind of selfishness. So it was very interesting to think about the contribution of different worldviews and perspectives. I spent some time, when I was doing this project, I went to a grassroots Tea Party activist training conference, and I showed up as a kind of participant observer. And it was really interesting. I got from them this Americans for Prosperity pen that I carried around after that for a long while. And I was just thought for a long time, like, what if I was from this worldview, that I thought, you know, that climate change was a hoax and that individual property rights were being threatened. And these people were just extremely nice at the Tea Party training session, and it just reminded me that like we tend to just hang out with our group very much. You know, we're a group right here. The very day that I was at the Tea Party activist training session, there was it was right after a whole group of my people had been doing this conference on power shift. And it was like, we're all kind of getting together to think about how we make the world a better place, but we don't often kind of come together. Okay, I have a few more minutes. Few other things I wanted to bring up about this climate change issue to move us a little bit beyond thinking about differences in kind of culturally and worldview. This is another perspective that even among people who believe climate change is happening, there is this, oftentimes we're really not doing that much about it. So we can't necessarily just kind of sit on our high horse that we believe in it and we kind of are the righteous ones. Carrie Norgaard, who's an environmental sociologist at the University of Oregon, wrote an interesting book, Living in Denial, Climate Change Emotions in Everyday Life. She's an ethnographer. She spent a year in a small community in Norway. And what she noticed there is she was there at a time where the snow was coming like 2 months later than it usually did, a time when the ice wasn't freezing over in the lakes, where ice fishing is a real traditional part of the culture there. And what she did is she just spent a year kind of looking at how people were talking about these changes or not in the communities. This was a community where people generally believed that climate change was happening, pretty progressive, pretty educated. But when she sat down at, you know, in the coffee shop, when she read the local newspaper, she found that climate change discussions were pretty much absent. And that when people brought the issue up in conversation, she would watch and notice how quickly people would stop talking about it. That climate change was just not really polite conversation. And I bet many of you also feel that way in your communities as well. When you bring it up, it's like, well, let's just not go there. So there is this sense of kind of like an implicit denial in it. Even if we believe in it, there are these kind of socially constructed norms to not like address it together. Renee Lertzman is someone who provides another kind of perspective on us, kind of this implicit denial of climate change, and she has this concept of the myth of apathy, that maybe the issue of climate change is actually so anxiety-provoking that the reason we're not dealing with it or talking about it is that it's just too hard for us, and that, that shuts us down. There's been some studies actually that if you don't present kind of like solutions at the scale of the problem that climate change presents, that people really shut down to even admitting that there is a problem. So the last piece is, I find very interesting, is that in addition to that kind of the political pieces making it hard for us to discuss it, the cultural tendencies to kind of line up on the climate change issue in different ways, is that each one of us, psychologically and cognitively, have a really hard time getting our heads wrapped around this issue. So I'm going to just talk about 4 different studies to kind of highlight some of these psychological and cultural, psychological and cognitive challenges. The first one is that we all have a tendency towards selective attention. I'm not sure if you've seen this study before, but there's 2 groups here, one in white, one in dark. And when people are asked to count how many times the white team passes the ball, they get a minute. You know, this happens for a minute. They pass the ball about 14 times. And people are pretty good at like counting how many times they pass the ball, even though there's another ball being thrown around. What they tend to miss, as you can see a little foot here, there's the gorilla walking across. And like, it's just amazing that we could miss this gorilla walking across just because our attention is on the ball being thrown. And I find this akin to the climate change issue, is that, you know, our daily lives, we're focused on getting our kids fed, our work, things like that, and that we don't see, like, think about the CO2 atmospheric parts per million going up by 2 or 3 parts per million every year. Someone mentioned earlier Dan Kahneman, who's a Nobel-winning economist that wrote this book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Awesome, really good book. And he makes the point that we make poor decisions when our brains are tied up, and they are frequently tied up, right? So if you do it, there's a study, if you give people like 7 numbers to hold in their head at one time, which is cognitively a very hard thing to do, and you do that, and at the same time you offer people a healthy fruit salad or a not so healthy but tasty chocolate cake, if they're holding all these numbers in their mind, they're going to take the cake rather than the fruit. So, you know, our lives are very busy. We get tied up with things. It makes it hard for us to make good decisions, right? We tend to favor short-term benefits with long-term costs. So the climate change issues, we heard about it. You heard about we put emissions into the atmosphere. What we do now is going to be beneficial to future generations. The policies we put into place are going to serve us in the future. But this is really hard for us as a human species to do. Here are 2 different scenarios here. Warming possibilities in 2100 under policy scenarios. We'll end up with a world that's 2, 3, 4 degrees warmer. If we don't put policies into place now to bring down emissions and reduce fossil fuel use, we're going to end up with a world that's upwards of 7 degrees warmer. Last one is our brains are evolved to deal with threats quite well. Like evolutionarily, we're really good at identifying threats and responding to them. But we're really good at dealing with threats that have certain qualities that are intentional, immoral, imminent, and instantaneous. The thing with climate change is they have none of these factors. They're not, people don't see us flying across the country for a vacation or a conference. That's not seen as intentionally harming the planet and future generations. We don't currently have, it's not immoral to be someone with a big carbon footprint or to not take action on climate issues. The threats aren't seen as imminent or instantaneous. These ideas are brought forward by Dan Gilbert, and here he is giving a presentation, And it's titled, "It's the End of the World as We Know It, and I Feel Fine." So just a couple slides in summary here. Some people were asking about what do we need to do now. I find these two graphs, they kind of motivate me here. I'm looking at the trends in emissions here. These colorful lines are different scenarios. The line of the actual emissions is the black line, often on the upper end of what the different scenarios and projections have been. We had a dip in 2009 during the global recession, and we're back up beyond what we could have imagined. So every year we're going up in our emissions and atmospheric concentration. What we need to do to avoid catastrophic warming is, here's the slide put forward by Kevin Anderson that basically shows that we need to have dramatic reductions in emissions. And these three lines show that the sooner we do this, here is now, the less steep the reductions we have to make, and fewer total and less reductions in the end. The longer we wait, the steeper the reductions and the fewer ultimate emissions we can have. So this is a big challenge. I'm working on my PhD right now, and my mentor out of the University of Norway, Karen O'Brien, her big field is around the topic of transformation. Because how do we transform society? How do we transform ourselves to have this reality versus that reality? And that's really difficult. How do we do that in a planned, peaceful way rather than violent, chaotic way? So in terms of thinking about that, there's, again, just to summarize, a lot of different challenges we have from the political side, needing to recognize the power of special interests to shape politics and public sentiment and bolster excuses for delayed action, cultural drivers. We have this real human tendency to be tribal, to protect our identity and demonize others. I'm going to be leading a session this afternoon about leading conversations to actually work on kind of this whole polarity and what might it feel like to empathize with the other. And psychological drivers. Our brains are not wired to address the complex challenges climate change presents. So in my own work, I always think about how to move beyond those challenges, right? So this is what I'm personally doing, working to better understand different beliefs, perspectives, and worldviews. And then I'm working on methods for how to bring people together in dialogue. So if we understand that we show up thinking differently, what happens when we bring that awareness to conversations, we actually engage people in dialogue? I mean, I see at the end of every talk, and I'm really sorry I keep talking, everyone wants to come up and talk. Like, we want to have systems where we are productively engaged in thinking about the future of our planet. There are really interesting evolutions across the nation that are using these deliberative processes to help make policy around city budgets, schools, and I'm working on it around the climate change issue. We did an interesting campus conversation on campus at the university. We brought in about 100 people, worked in small groups. We talked about our climate action plan. The evening went on for about 3 hours. It was incredibly, Jill was there as one of our moderators. I think students left feeling very uplifted that they were a valued participant in the conversations. They left feeling less alarmed about the climate change issue because they realized there were solutions that we were working on. And you can see some really good listening and engagement here. So ending on that note, and I'm done. And now you can go to lunch. Thanks.
Thank you, Nikki, so much. And is that not fascinating information to really start to unpack? How do we humans behave given this crushing experience of climate change? So thank you so much. What I think might be helpful now, we did design this so that you would now start to think in this different way and talk about this over lunch. And is it okay with you if we defer questions so that there's an opportunity to talk with Nikki more in a focus session this afternoon. You can talk with her at lunch. But what I'm interested in is what you all talk with each other about. And then we'll have a chance later to kind of touch base on that. And thank you, Nikki, so much for that great talk. Really, really good. Really excellent.